Hello and welcome. You're listening to Leveraging Thought Leadership. I'm your host, Bill Sherman, and today we're talking about one of my personal passions, organizational thought leadership. That is, the people who create, curate, and deploy thought leadership on behalf of their organization. My guest today is Dr. Vince Molinaro. Vince is an example of how a practice lead inside a consulting organization can use thought leadership to grow the business. Vince's area of expertise is leadership. He spent 13 years at Knightsbridge Human Capital Solutions and then 3 years at Lee Hecht & Harrison as their Global Managing Director of Leadership Transformation. In addition, Vince has written 3 books on leadership and co-authored 2 others. And now he runs his own company as CEO of Leadership Contract Incorporated. Vince, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Bill. Really looking forward to the conversation.
Fantastic. So let's start with your background. You've got a PhD, you focused in education and then leadership, and then you started at Knightsbridge. So tell me how you started to use thought leadership when you were at Knightsbridge.
Well, it goes back many years before when I was 27, started my first company. And at the time I was a career counselor and I kind of liked writing articles. And I found that actually played a role in helping establish my brand and my company at the time. Now, at the time, it wasn't called thought leadership, but that was something that I always sort of did. So, you fast forward a number of years and to the reference point of Knightsbridge, we always, as part of our strategy, had thought leadership as a pivotal part of how we were not only growing the brand, building our credibility, but really creating greater value for our customers. In fact, in the early days when we started, thinking moves ahead was really our motto and our tagline. And so this connection between thought and the value you can bring to your clients was just ingrained in how we thought about our company and our business and how we wanted to be perceived in the market.
And I think you touch on a really good point there, is many people were active in thought leadership even before we had the term today, right? Whether that was individuals or organizations.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
So with that, how did you get into, so you said Knightsbridge had the values and the motto, but at some point, did you step up and say, hey, I'm going to start writing and doing thought leadership? Did someone come to you? What's that story?
Yeah, so I joined Knightsbridge, came through an acquisition. So the firm I was with just before that, it was there for about 4 or 5 months. And I joined that kind of midterm consulting company to drive their learning and leadership practice. And I said to them, listen, I'm going to come in, I'm going to write articles, I'm going to probably write books, and I'm going to create IP off of that. So that was the other important thing for me. It wasn't just creating thought leadership for the sake of thought leadership. It was an opportunity to create really differentiated intellectual property. And then, so I began to do that. And then after the acquisition, really continued to do that. And then at some point, I was given the role to lead the leadership practice within Knightsbridge, which I did for about a decade of my time there. And so thought leadership was always part of what we did. I did it personally. I worked with colleagues on my team. We tried to really encourage other practitioners in other practices, whether it was in the search or career transition practice or in my own practice, to really contribute their insights and ideas that they gleaned from working with some of the leading companies that were part of our client base.
You mentioned the creation of IP. And I think in an area such as leadership, that becomes essential if you're going to do thought leadership in an area as leadership, because it's easy to do content marketing or repeat what others have said. There's good stuff that's been said before, but it takes an effort to say, I'm going to raise the bar and add something new to the conversation on leadership as a topic. Talk about that mindset and sort of that ambition where you sit and you say, okay, this is something people have been talking about for years. What do I have to say that's new, different, interesting, or to a different audience?
Well, it's funny, how you position that. It's so accurate. But as I reflect on, the answer, it really is rooted in my academic preparation. Because ultimately, as a researcher, your job is really to create new knowledge. And part of that process is to look at any field and to say, okay, what do we know about that topic now? What are the shortfalls of what we know in terms of solving current problems or future problems we face, and what new knowledge will your research reveal that will really advance our thinking. So in many ways, my own take on that was really influenced by my graduate work that I did as I ran my company. So I was kind of immersed in two worlds for a period of time, where I was in that kind of academic research world and then in the entrepreneurial world, and merging the two was quite fascinating. So to me, that really is that on a more practical level, your clients come to you with their toughest problems, right? Because if they could solve all their problems, they wouldn't need consultants like us. And so when they come with your toughest problems, and the advantage we have is you see one problem when in one organization, and then you start seeing that same pattern emerge company after company. They don't know that because they tend to be kind of focused in, heads down, focused in their own company. But someone who consults and has that external view sees it, because you really cross a number of companies. And so then that's where that process comes in. Okay, so what do we know about this challenge? What's missing in the thinking and in the practice? And how can we, through our research, our thinking, in partnership with our customers, really generate new insights that help companies be more successful? So for me, that's clearly the driver, is ultimately how do we continue to create great value for organizations so they can continue to be more successful?
The creation of value is very much the language of someone running a practice. You want to serve your clients so that you create value, so that you're growing the business. At the same time, you're talking from the language of a researcher and adding new knowledge, right? So how did you marry those two worlds to use the new knowledge you've created to grow the business? What did you do and how did you do it? So tell that story, please.
If we think about the work I did in leadership, it began with a customer problem where, around just really coming out of the tail end of the great financial global crisis, 2008, 2009. I think at that time, a lot of companies were reevaluating a number of things in their companies. And one of the things they were reevaluating was leadership development. And by that time, the spend in leadership development had continued to increase. But I was just encountering this frustration around, we're spending the money, we're doing everything that's supposed to be best practices, but we're not seeing it translate into stronger leadership. There's something going on here. And they were kind of bewildered, and they didn't have an answer. And as I started to hear this over and over and over again as a problem, I began to say, there's something here we got to dig into. And as I stepped back and thought about the challenges, this idea of a leadership contract came to my head around, I think what's missing is we have a lot of people in leadership roles who don't fully appreciate what it really means to be a leader and are not then stepping up to the expectations of their companies. And so those ideas kind of began to formulate, that began to grow. And then as I was testing the ideas with clients, I was seeing that that's right, this is what's missing. This is what we need. And that was kind of the validation process. So it's kind of this kind of go back, you've got an idea, then you kind of try it out, you get initial feedback, you iterate, and then you start writing. And then, the leadership contract came out in 2013, and it really tried to uncover this kind of 4 terms of this contract that a lot of leaders aren't aware of. And it immediately resonated in the market. We built products and solutions around that we brought into our client organizations. And for Knightsbridge, when we did it, we were expanding out of Canada into the US and used the thought leadership strategy to grow our brand in the world's largest leadership development market. And very quickly, went from zero revenue into the US to millions in a fairly short period of time, because that formula kind of worked. But I think it's not just about the book. It's not just about a speech. It's about having that whole platform of solutions you can bring to a customer tied to the ideas that help them solve that pressing problem. And, that was the journey we were on. And then I started to, as we were doing a lot of client work, new problems emerged. And then then Knightsbridge was acquired by Lee Hecht Harrison. At the time, they wrote myself and a colleague into the deal saying, you guys need to come over. And they gave him the country to run, and they gave me a global role to say, you seem to have figured out a formula that worked at Knightsbridge. Help us do that here on a global basis. And so we basically took the formula we developed around thought leadership and research and IP and really exported it globally. And there as well, in a very short period of time, after traveling to 25 countries, 80 cities, we went net new incremental revenue from zero with these solutions, around 11 million euros. And you really got to see that formula put into action. But then the clients kind of said, okay, this is great, but you know what? We need more from our leaders. We need them to not only hold themselves accountable, they need to really hold others accountable. They got to build accountable teams, and they've got to work together to ensure that accountability is ingrained in our culture. How do we do that? And so that led me to write my newest book, Accountable Leaders, that just came out, that really now takes those ideas more from an organizational lens. And in my company, we're developing solutions to bring to clients as well. So that's kind of been the flow of the story and how we've kind of gone at it.
Well, and that's fantastic. And I can hear in that story you were wearing several hats along the way, still serving clients, finding time to write books, and then get out there to speak and attract attention for it. I think one of the things that a lot of practice leads who think that, they're going to get into thought leadership, they'll write the book and then all of a sudden business writes itself because you're a published author. And that process usually isn't as simple. Of the people say, oh, you're published now, great, come in and solve this problem. Talk about how coming from Canada into the US market, how did you get that attention and how did thought leadership play in that role? What did you do? How did you get noticed? What did you try that worked? And what was like, wow, we wouldn't repeat that again because it didn't have any traction?
Yeah, well, one of the things we did is we partnered with a small firm in Boston that did outbound sales calls, right? And the business model was really simple. He would call a bunch of organizations in the industries that we wanted our focus on to kind of land appointments that then our salespeople would go in to start talking about Knightsbridge and talking about our solutions. And we had developed an initial script tied to my book, The Leadership Contract. And I remember one afternoon, he called me on my cell and he was just frantic. He goes, it's about leadership accountability. That's it. That's the hot button issue. And once he clicked in on that, then his track record of conversion just went through the roof. That somehow between the ideas and him reaching out to organizations, he landed on that, and that became an accelerator. Once we got really, really clear on what was the hot button issue, and while my ideas in my book talked a lot about a leadership accountability, it probably wasn't framed as clearly as the customers were seeing the problem or organizations were seeing the problem. So I think that was something that really helped accelerate, our ability to be successful there. The other thing we did is, the United States is a massive market. So we focused on a few areas. For example, our first office we opened in Chicago because we felt that, kind of that Midwest culture was similar to the Canadian culture and that we would have, success there. And that kind of worked. The challenge that we faced, and I think all professional services firm and probably all companies face, is really of building scale. How do you build the consistent delivery arm, the consistent sales arm to bring a unified experience, like the success we were having in our home country? How are we ensuring that we're generating that, in a new market? And that is always, scale is always the challenge, to drive that consistent growth. We had hiccups along the way, but I think overall we were able to drive some success to the point that, Knightsbridge was quite a sizable firm. And then, the Adecco Group and LHH came along and acquired us. So that's a testament to our success and the power of the brand that was built at that time.
If you are enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about the podcast, please leave a 5-star review and share it with your friends. We are available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all major platforms, as well as at leveragingthoughtleadership.com. You talk about scale, and I think one of the things that thought leadership is about is taking an idea to scale. And you mentioned the first step is you got to get your salespeople to understand what is it that we're selling? What is this idea? Because if they don't understand the idea, It's going to be harder for them to communicate to a prospect or a buyer. If it's an existing client and you're trying to communicate a new idea, they need to know what they're talking about, whether that's in a meeting, at a dinner. And so they have to understand. And then your delivery arm has to understand what's this idea that we're implementing in the organization. And all of those are prerequisites to implement before you can bring that idea inside of an organization to scale. And so I think your answer was very much on point with the opportunity that thought leadership allows, as well as one of the challenges. You have to be looking, going, does my team get it? Or am I the one person in the organization saying, I've got this great idea?
And part of the evolution that we learned we needed to do at LHH is, it was the world's largest career transition company, a huge brand, and they had a sizable talent business. Even to today, they're recognized as one of the top 10 training firms. So a really great story there. But the other sales implication is, historically they sold a set of products or solutions to their customers, and it was a more transactional sale. The second you start introducing thought leadership into the mix, it now shifts the expectations of that salesperson. They now need to come in at a little bit more of an elevated level. It's less about a product sale. It's more about having a business conversation. And we found that some were able to just migrate to make that leap really, really quickly, and others really, really struggled. And because our solutions were leadership development solutions, what they all said is, well, if I can experience this program personally, that would really help me. And we clearly saw whenever we were able to do that, we saw that impact on the success of those salespeople in the very regions they were geographically. So I think that's the other thing that you have to understand if you are an internal thought leadership practitioners. This interface between marketing and sales is critical. And you need to kind of gauge, can your folks, you got to help them understand how to have a sales conversation that's about thought leadership, that's about presenting a point of view. And sometimes you may have a prospect in front of you who disagrees with you. And a salesperson never wants to have a prospect disagree with them. And that, we would say, but that's okay. That's going to start a conversation, right? Dig into why they disagree with it. It'll help you uncover their needs even further in a way you didn't before. So those are the subtleties that we learned just through trial and error of seeing what was working, what was not working as quickly as we would have liked. So I think that is the other element. If you're kind of a thought leadership practitioner inside a company, kind of with your own small team, and you're an island disconnected from the rest, or on the other side, you're housed in marketing, and it's essentially a content factory, I don't think those models work as much. You've got to find a way to really integrate, into the business, both from a sales marketing standpoint.
Several things here. One, that sense of what is the business, your business that you're creating thought leadership for, trying to accomplish. Second, who are you trying to reach with your thought leadership? And is that the same as your current buyer of services? Is it an extension? Is it a different pain point? All of those things impact how sales has the conversation. One of the things that I've seen successfully, whether it's a practice lead doing thought leadership or a head of thought leadership, is you've got to sit down with marketing. You've got to sit down with sales. You've got to understand what the pulse of the field is saying so that you're not talking in a vacuum. Because if you're not connected with what the world is talking about or what problems people on the buy side are trying to solve, you're in an echo chamber. You're writing for yourself.
You're absolutely right. The challenge there is you need to kind of strike this balance of definitely tapping into the field, because they're in front of prospects and customers every day, number one, which is great. Number two, though, is you will get ideas and insights that are across the spectrum, where there were times when you think, well, we should be setting up a compensation practice because, I went into this one prospect and if we did this, I would be able to drive that sale. And I would go, but we're not a compensation firm. Why would we even do that? Mm-hmm. So you gotta manage that a little bit. But I definitely agree with you. I think you've got to put in some practices that regularly tap into the insight of sales and marketing, because they're so close to your prospects and your customers.
If you look at sort of the arc of your work on leadership, it seems in some ways that comment that you said, your sales guy going, oh, it's about accountability, that feedback has sort of influenced the shape of the content that you've been creating going forward. Is that fair to say on that?
Well, I think for me it comes back to probably my research background, right? It's at the end of the day, thought leadership is a hypothesis at best, right? Of how you think the world should be or how you think a problem should be solved. And if it's informed by a lot of actual experience in customers or working with leaders, then then you're good. And I think when it's not, then these are far-flung, and in the leadership world in particular is filled of really great romantic ideas that I know when I read it, they may sound intriguing, but will not work in practice, right? And so I think that's one of the variables. But I think my nature is sometimes I feel like I'm almost like a stand-up comic where I'm always testing material, so to speak, right? I've got a notebook that I write feverishly. In fact, when I was writing my most recent book, I was, had done all the external research, right, that you would do to create a book. And then I thought, wait a minute, I got all my notebooks and I keep all my notebooks. And I found in my garage a couple of banker's boxes, and I had notebooks to 2000 and dating back to 2005. And I went through every single page, really kind of saying, what did I see from the leadership standpoint over that period of time? It was pre-great, the financial crisis, and everything since then. And that became really fascinating to see that play out. But for me, my nature is so that validation that, I'm thinking about this. What do you think? You get a reaction. And that kind of keeps feeding your ideas. So I've caught in the back of my notebook all of my brain waves that come, and I kind of I jot them down, and then I'm constantly testing the ideas, formulating the theory, so to speak.
So the connection between hypothesis testing and stand-up comedy, I think, is spot on, right? You may fall in love with something and think it's the greatest piece ever, but if it doesn't get traction, if people don't lean in or it goes over their heads, it doesn't matter if you're brilliant. You've got to meet people where they are with your content.
Yeah, and it's why I made a decision early on that academia wasn't for me. Right, is because I could have easily done that. And in many ways, I sometimes feel like an entrepreneurial academic. It's taking the things that I learned in research, and particularly qualitative research, applying them in the world of business, and bringing that sense of rigor in how research is done and ideas are cultivated. And that, I think, and everyone has their own formula. That was my formula.
You've had a couple different perspectives in terms of being the researcher, being an entrepreneur, doing your own writing, then doing IP creation inside of various firms, and now back to being your own entrepreneur who's creating content and putting it out into the world. If you had advice for someone who is a practitioner, practice lead, who has an area of expertise, and they're often running on the challenge of, I've got a billable hour, or I'm responsible for filling the pipeline. How do you balance those responsibilities with creating IP, and then give them advice on what might work, what might not work, and then talk about where you are today?
It's a great question. And part of my roles, particularly the internal roles, was to help others grow, those who were motivated to become thought leaders. And what I would often say is, well, let's start capturing your thoughts. So why don't you write a blog? Let's start with one blog. Can you get your ideas down in one blog, 1,000 words? And I can tell you, of all the people that would come to me, I wouldn't hear back from 95% of them. And of the 5% who'd come back and say, great, let's edit it, and we're going to post it. Now I'm really interested in your 10th blog. So let's start developing a map on how do you get from your first blog to your 10th blog. 95% never came back. So in many ways, it's really easy, right? It's really easy for people to become thought leaders, but you got to find a way to create how you approach your job or how you approach your work. So you are carving out time to capturing your ideas. Sometimes we become our own barriers because we look for perfection. We stare at the blank page. It doesn't have to be good. The creation process is separate from the editing process. So just fill that blank laptop with ideas, and you will refine them over time. The great thing, why I get jazzed about it now, is there's so many more options to put out your IP, right? To put out your thoughts, whether it is a 1,000-word blog, whether it's a video. There are really no barriers now, because traditionally when I started, it was you had to write a book. Everyone tries to jump to the book. You don't need a book. You could do really well with a really well-developed, well-designed, thoughtful ebook that's about 4,000 words. That's a chapter in a book, so there are ways to chunk that work down, but I find many of us kind of get in our own way sometimes. So I think that's what I would do. Just carve out your role so you're constantly finding ways to figure out a formula where you can spend time to think and capture the outputs of your thinking and then put it out to the world and get feedback. The market will tell you whether your ideas have any value immediately. And that's okay. If you don't get the response you want, it's okay. You just keep at it. You keep at it. And I find it's just a practical exercise. And you got to find how to orient your life that way.
Well, and from a rapid prototyping perspective, the ability to test ideas is so much easier now, right?
Exactly.
So with writing a book, you work on it, you polish it, you get your manuscript done, goes through editing, and you put it out in the world and you wait to see what people think, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to you can go on LinkedIn, do a short post, and you'll see very quickly what feedbacks, likes, and responses you've gotten, or if there are crickets. And so a buddy of mine years ago when blogging started said, you have to be prepared for the long haul if you're going into this. And he said, if you're not ready to do it 100 times, rethink what you're doing and make it simpler so that you're committed to doing it 100 times.
And what you think may resonate. So I'll produce a blog and I'll kind of go, oh, that's a good one. And you put it out there and you kind of go, why that didn't have the reaction I thought it was going to have. And then you post something that it's even just a throwaway. Like when the pandemic started, I had this insight. I said, oh, wow, the extroverts are going to lose their time during lockdown. And the introverts are probably going to relish this period. So a few weeks went by and I just decided, let me put that out there to see. And that thing generated a ton of interest and activity and commenting and views. And that's not even something I would have expected. But so you just, to your point, you just got to try and you'll get feedback. Now, I'm not going to be doing work on introverts versus extroverts, but the whole point is really about, you just never know what's going to be meaningful and resonates with people. But if you're always worrying about putting the one perfect piece out, you'll never figure it out. So just put as good quality that you can put out on a consistent basis. And as you said, Bill, over the long haul.
That's really good advice, Vince. And I loved what you said about the mentoring and asking that question of, okay, you got one out. How are you going to get 10? And preparing people for the journey. I think people think that one piece of thought leadership is enough. It's a magic bullet. And that's not true. It's the persistence that matters.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I sort of think about it as, being on this massive beach and your blog post or your Twitter comment is one grain of sand, right? And that's the reality today because of the volume of ideas that are out there. But that's okay. You'll find your audience, you'll find your fan base, the people who will resonate with your perspective. They're out there. You've got to find it. But if you put nothing out, you'll never find them. And that's where you got to begin.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Vince, for taking time to talk with us today.
Thank you. It was a great chat. Appreciate it, Bill.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please join our LinkedIn group, Organizational Thought Leadership. It's a professional community where thought leadership practitioners talk shop about our field. So if you're someone who creates, curates, or deploys thought leadership for your organization, then please join the conversation in the Organizational Thought Leadership LinkedIn